I am Gaganendranath, Chairperson, Department of Art History and Visual Arts, Punjab University, Chandigarh. In this module, we will look at art in the early 20th century in the country. The third decade of the 20th century brought new impulses into Indian art that had far-reaching consequences in the direction modern Indian art was to take. This module discusses the work of two pioneers of modernism whose approach and practice played a seminal role in Indian art. The eclectic practices of Gaganendranath Tagore that derived from the Pan-Asian movement as also modern European art is discussed with emphasis on establishing the chronology of his work. Rabindranath Tagore's innings as a painter, though it began late in his life, was of great significance in modern Indian art. His art and its evolution over a period of a little over a decade is discussed in detail. The early 20th century was a period of ferment in modern Indian art. One phase of Indian modernism, which is described as an Orientalist approach or revivalism, had emerged in Kolkata and spread to various parts of the country by the 1920s. From within the same milieu, yet with a different individualist expression, emerged some of the pioneers of modernism. One being Gaganendranath Tagore, the older brother of Rabindranath Tagore. The two had shared many of the formative influences, and Gaganendranath Tagore also participated with the Bengal school artists in the exhibitions of the Indian Society of Oriental Art. Yet, he painted to a different tune and held his ground most independently. This was despite the fact that he was involved in the different activities and other facets of the Bengal school. Similarly, Rabindranath Tagore, the uncle of Gaganendranath and Rabindranath, poet laureate, too had been involved in the formation and furtherance of the Bengal school. Yet, when he turned to art in his 60s, it was a completely individualistic expression that exemplifies his contention that the artist should not be bound by any conventions or ideologies. Gaganendranath Tagore. Learnt painting from Hari Narayan Bose while still at school, but was essentially self-taught as he did not undergo rigorous formal training in an art school. Thus, the earliest technique he employed was watercolors. Ratan Parimu identifies and dates the earliest examples of his work to about circa 1907, when he painted landscapes of Puri in brush and thin color on postcards to send to his daughter. Another early influence on him is identified as his uncle, Jyotirndra-nath, who had trained at the art school, and Gaganendranath imitated his drawing style. In fact, Gaganendranath took to painting seriously only in his late 30s, and his work with its variations and phases highlights an eclecticism. We'll initially discuss the influence of Japanese brush and ink painting. An important influence in his evolution as an artist was his introduction to Japanese brush and ink painting. Around the end of 1902 and beginning of 1903, two Japanese painters, Taikan and Hishida, arrived in Kolkata as the follow-up to the interaction of Okakura with the Tagores and the growing influence of the Pan-Asian movement. Gaganendranath was greatly influenced by the brush painting in Chinese ink that resulted in Japanese effect in works that show fluent strokes and rich, dark tones of fluid ink. Works depicting rooftops, rain-drenched crows and landscapes, and also his works for Rabindranath Tagore's autobiography, Jeevan Smriti, show this influence clearly. Paintings such as Crow, and view of a mosque and skyline. Show the fluid brush strokes with the contrast of black and white conveying depth and atmosphere. His understanding of the Japanese brush and ink painting can be gauged from the different brush strokes revealed in his work, such as bokushoku, the rice dot, and the nail head, and rat tail line. Ratan Parimu also makes the significant point that the conceptual range of this art also interested Gaganendranath, as visible in certain landscapes by him, in which the oriental vastness and infiniteness of space is evoked. As seen in his work, the Ganges again and the boat Padma. His alignment with Japanese aesthetics is also revealed by the fact that, like in the work of Japanese painters, he too based his landscapes on the same scheme of heaven, man, earth, and by incorporating water as the sea or rain or waterfall in his paintings. Ratan Parimu, underlining the deep influence of Japanese art during his formative period, states that his handling of sumai displayed skill worthy of a master, which in his opinion is especially conspicuous in the studies of crows. But interestingly, some of his works exhibited in 1914 and 1916 are in the Indian style painting, as seen in the series on the life of Chaitanya. Thus, in the same period, his work shows a certain contrasting diversity of styles. The Japanese style works, with their boldness and vigor, is the antithesis of the imaginative mannerisms of the Bengal school manner. Now we look at his satirical caricatures done between 1915 and 1921. His Gaganendranath's individualistic approach emerged with greater sharpness around 1915-16 when he ventured into the genre of caricatures in the medium of lithography. Scholars date this phase of his work from 1915 to 1921. Bitingly satirical works, in these he comments on the ills and hypocrisies in society at large, be it politics, education, religion, and social norms. Done in a limited color palette of black, white and grey, along with a yellow ochre or dull green or red, the works at times include text in 2 or 3 lines that is both title and satirical comment. These works were done in the technique of lithography, for which a press was set up at the Bichitra Club. 3 volumes of his satirical lithographs were published. The Realm of the Absurd, 1970, Strange Thunderbolts or Birup Vajra. The comment is on Bengali society, particularly the elite, and consists of 13 color and black and white cartoons. One such work, Auto Spichala, or an automatic speech-making machine. The Realm of the Absurd or Adbhut Lok is a comment on human absurdities and weakness. Pyare Mia. Noble Man are some of the works from this. And the series done in 1921, The Reform Screams, deals with political reform and with the Montag Chelmsford Report, and essentially deals with contemporary political events between 1919 and 1921. Some exemplars of his work are the fake Brahmin dispensing blessing for lucre, and a wrong combination, dance of the emancipated Bengali lady. The economy of lines, heavy faces and bodies with only the essential elements depicted, and the moral comment suggest derivations from the Kalighat parts. Considering the pictorial treatment of the cartoon and what the artist is aiming at, Amit Mukhopadhyay states that his cartoons are narrative cartoons and that Gaganendranath sets his cartoons in the style of a painting. Now we look at his interpretation of Cubism in his landscape paintings and also the caricatures. Gaganendranath Tagore's concern is with representing the visual impressions of the reality around him. But over time, a shift becomes visible in his work towards memory, imagination and his inner world. According to Ratan Parimu, this romanticism becomes more pronounced in the late phase. Parthamitra relates this change in Gaganendranath's approach to the year 1915 that marks his quiet withdrawal from his brother's nationalist preoccupations, marking his journey into a poetic fairy tale world. Drawing upon the Bengali stage and literature. The cultural milieu of Jorashanko, the ancestral home of the Tagores, was the incubator for this. Both Parimu and Mittal attribute the staging of plays by Rabindranath Tagore there, for which Gaganendranath designed the sets for his preoccupation with imaginary interiors, artificial lights, light creating criss-cross patterns and shadows. In his paintings in the 1920s, the references to multiple screens, artificial lights, and stage props are visible. Mittal also relates the mysterious long corridors, illuminated windows, half-open doors, staircases, and vaults in his work to Piranesi's Karkari prints. This is seen in his experiments with Cubism, which date to at least 1922 and continue up to 1929, as evidenced by Stella Kramrisch's evaluation of his works published in that year. In fact, the year 1922 was also important as the Indian Society of Oriental Art hosted an exhibition of the Bauhaus artists in Kolkata featuring Kandinsky, Klee, Feininger, Johannes Itten, George Muck, Gerhard Marx, Lothar Schreier, Margrit, Terry Adler, Sophie Kohner, and 49 practice works in the course of instruction, along with the work by the English watercist Wyndham Lewis. Gaganendranath's works were also exhibited alongside. In this period, his interest was in light and not volume, and the works express his fascination for the space-defining characteristics of interpenetrating planes. The light has a prismatic quality as its splinters and beams crisscross. He is known to have looked for devices to intensify color patterns, such as holding up a crystal against light to capture the colors that appear on the paper below. These modernist experiments have been described as visible music and pulsating light, with the most typical works of this phase said to be from the mid-1920s. The two versions of Destruction of Dwarka, Swarnapuri, and the two versions of Satbai Champa, the cover of Rabindranath's play Rakt Karbi. The works of this phase depict mysterious interiors, veiled women, visionary landscapes that all are enveloped in a prismatic luminosity of light and color. And even as his titles allude to myths and narratives, yet the poetic imagery, by its very ambiguity, and the abstracted play of light and shadow, simultaneously rejected any literary or illustrative crutches, particularly in the works from 1925 onwards. Gaganendranath suffered a stroke and was bedridden for the last 8 years of his life, that is, ended his artistic experiments. We'll briefly look at the assessment of his Cubist phase and his role as a pioneering modernist. In his assessment of Gaganendranath Tagore's Cubism, and in response to Archer's criticism of his work being failed modernism, Parthamitra states that seen in a global context and how Cubism was received in countries other than France, Gaganendranath's approach is absolutely valid. His is not the formal, analytic Cubism of Braque Picasso, and he was aware that he was not reproducing that. Instead, Cubism gave him a flexible language with its broken surfaces and released a new energy in him, enabling him to create his own fairy tale world. In fact, his work was noted by critics in an exhibition in Berlin in 1923, and affinities were drawn with Feininger's indifference to the formal implications of analytic Cubism. Tapti Guha Thakurta states that though both European Cubism and Futurism set the context for Gaganendranath Tagore's experiments, and that whatever the assessment, whether these are seen as mere decorative stylizations and weak un-Indian imitations, or as exhibiting an independent approach to the technique with respect to the interest in light and space, these experiments in modernism opened the door to a new internationalism for the Indian artist. In fact, both Gaganendranath and Rabindranath's work, in its openness to internationalism and rejection of a narrow nationalist approach, anticipated the future direction of Indian art. Now we will look at the other artist to be discussed in this module, that is Rabindranath Tagore. One of the most celebrated poets of India, Rabindranath Tagore was born on 7th May 1861 in the Jorashankar mansion at Kolkata. He was the youngest child of Rabindranath Tagore and Sarada Devi and had 12 siblings. Rabindranath showed interest in various creative fields like music, literature, dance, visual arts. In 1913, he won the Nobel Prize for Gitanjali, and with that he became a known figure in Europe as well. He was probably the greatest Indian thinker of his times. Being a true Renaissance man, Tagore wrote on various subjects, including liberalization of women in our society, and interaction among different cultures for the cultivation of knowledge and benefit of this interaction for both societies. He believed that such interaction between the East and the West can help in development of music, art and science, among other things. His philosophy, on which he based his thoughts, presented a bigger scheme that would benefit society as a whole. He was a well-travelled man and gathered influences. He called them gems of knowledge from wherever he could find them. Tagore was a versatile genius. He was a master in literature and music forms. His own writings overflow with love of life and a wonder and joy in nature. His philosophy is rich with spiritual values and a profound faith and understanding of man. Even before he started painting, he had many times presented his thoughts on the subject. This could be a result of his association with the artists in Bengal. His writings on art started early in the 20th century when he started taking interest in the art and the work of his nephews, Rabindranath Tagore and Gaganendranath Tagore. Rabindranath at the time was busy in guiding a group of artists from the region towards an Indian-style painting. Influenced by their ideology, Rabindranath initiated the founding of the Bichitra Club, which was aimed at encouraging and supporting the new art movement of Bengal. When Rabindranath travelled to Japan in 1916, he started advising his nephews on their painting through letters. He believed that Bengal artists were leaning too much on the tradition of the past, such as miniature paintings. During his Japan visit, Rabindranath saw the works of Yokoyama Taikan, Shimamura Kenzo and other Japanese artists who were involved in the Pan-Asian movement in art and were influenced by Okakura Kakuzo. He was of the firm belief that the artist should not be bound by the opinions of the critic or be circumscribed by race and should develop an individualist expression. In Tagore's What is Art? We can see his concern for personal expression of the artist in his work, which may not be bound by definitions. In this light, we will look at Rabindranath Tagore, the painter. Although Tagore had always shown an interest in the fine arts, but he started painting very late in his life, in his 60s. He never formally studied art, but was quite receptive to visual influences that came his way. In 1922, an exhibition of expressionist and futurist artists of the Bahus group was held in Calcutta. It had a major impact on Rabindranath and acted as a catalyst for him. His art is related to play or spontaneous activity that developed within him. As a child, he had taken drawing lessons, but it was not till much later that he seriously considered becoming an artist himself, as he had earlier felt that the muse of painting did not favor him. His introduction to the world as a painter happened in about 1930, in fact. On encouragement of his friend Victoria Ocampo, Tagore let out his creativity in the visual medium and later also put up an exhibition of his works. In a single year, exhibitions of his early artworks were held in Paris, Birmingham, London, Berlin, Munich, Dresden, Copenhagen, Geneva, Moscow, Boston and New York. Finally, in May 1931, it reached Philadelphia. The exhibition at Paris in 1930 had an introductory note by A.K. Kumaraswamy. In this, the author called the paintings examples of modern primitive art, childlike and playful vision. Kumaraswamy could not separate the artist from the poet and believed that these artworks were just an extension of Rabindranath's literary works and should not be taken as serious art, as Tagore did not follow the discipline of years of hard work that an artist has to go through. This shows that critics who value tradition in Indian art were unable to see and feel the depth of Tagore's drawings. However, this did not discourage him, and he created more than 2,000 drawings and paintings in a span of about 12 years. Doodles, erasures and paintings is what we are going to study. The beginning of Rabindranath's paintings is traced to the doodling and scratchings in his manuscripts. Ratan Parimu traces the beginnings of these to his manuscript of Purabi that was published in 1925 and the original of which is in Rabindra Bhavan, Shantiniketan. Parimu states that in this there are a number of whole pages that are completely covered with erasures that comprise a well-organized design that is balanced and harmonious. In fact, he also states that a page from an earlier manuscript of Rakta Karabi dated to 1923 also shows such forms. According to Parimu, the pages of Purabi contain a compendium of his forms and beasts, human, bird, snake creatures. Thus, according to him, serious painting activity by Tagore can be predated to 1924 at least. Though he concedes that there might have been long periods between 1924 and 1928 when Rabindranath did not paint. By the time he put up exhibitions of his paintings in different cities in Europe in 1930, he had around 400 paintings with him. So according to Parimu, 1928 is the year from when he ventured to doing independent paintings on separate sheets of paper. On the basis of this, he places the first phase of Tagore's work from 1924 to 30, dividing his paintings in this duration into manuscript doodles and those independent of the written page. In his early drawings, we can see a rhythmic flow forming shapes and motifs out of his handwriting and cross-outs in manuscripts. These drawings were done on paper with ink and essentially are doodles and deletions he made while writing verses. He had a naturally beautiful, rhythmic and clear handwriting. While writing, he would often cross out unnecessary lines or words, and gradually he started to join these in abstract patterns. These figurations didn't represent anything, but they came to have a rhythm, animation, texture and other qualities of art. He started adding little details such as eyes, beaks and tails, which related them to life. In his art, there is predilection for line. In a sense, he is not consciously creating art. In his own writings on art, Tagore talks about the principle of rhythm as being that which gave his work significance. He also opposes the need for representation. That is the reason he was compared to Kandinsky and Klee. There is a certain order and balance in his work. He said that these scratchings and cuttings started to cry out like sinners for salvation, and the only way was to join them together. Gradually, textural quality also became visible in his paintings. His works are a sincere expression of his personality and painted in an individualistic manner. They express the inner struggle of his mind and don't fall into any recognizable stylistic manner. The scope of his art is very wide because the source of his art is the unconscious. Parimu places his second or intermediate phase in the early 1930s. Tagore, in his second phase, introduced color and started painting pictures in which gradually his world of form emerged. In this period, there is a transition from the earlier linear flat pattern to concept of images in masses standing in space, and there is visible greater control over the handling of color and chromatic relationships. He repeatedly made forms of women in a hooded, sheathed sari. These figures show dignity, but are always alone. Tagore's Veiled Woman is a good example to understand this aspect of his work. The painting shows the figure of a woman with her head covered with the sari pallu. Tagore has applied color unevenly, which imparts a sense of tactility to the work. He painted most of his women with oval faces, brooding eyes and unsmiling lips. Brooding is another work in which a woman is painted with the head down as if in remorse. The women do express a personality and convey either shyness, modesty and melancholy. His depictions of women hardly have any erotic overtones. Whereas the faces of men are more varied, ranging from the comic to the tragic. Starting from doodled forms, they took the nature of masks. His individual heads show great variation of expressions and distortions. These are in the nature of grotesque masks, like in face. He also turned to his self-portrait, and Parimo suggests that he may have been his own first male model. The face as a mask is termed as one of his most obsessive images by Partha Mitter, who states that what took Tagore's work from the decorative to a more radical modernist plane was his discovery of Native American oceanic and African ritual masks, totemic animals, face scars and body tattoos. In these, the ears are cropped and other details are suppressed. Meanwhile, other elements that continue to be seen in his works are pure patterns, strange shapes, fantastic animals and birds. In his paintings, Rabindranath gives form to an imaginary world. Tagore's treatment of his landscapes shows a somber and moody effect. By this time, apart from the pen, he had started using color in his works. He applied colors with fingers and rags, which gave a textural quality to the paintings. The third phase of Rabindranath's painting is dated from about 1935 till his death in 1941 by Bratan Parimu. This phase can be seen as the culmination of his earlier work. His themes remain similar to his earlier phases. Much later in his painting, Tagore had started using a brush for applying color. This can be seen effectively in his landscape paintings. Very frequently in these works, the foreground is dark and sky is lit, imparting a glow from within to the landscape. Tagore was very experimental with his materials as he used varied mediums like inks, crayons and color varnish. The fact that he was not formally trained in art meant that he was experimental in his use of mediums and created a range of effects, one being the innovations he achieved in textures. He superimposed colored inks, sometimes in washes or at times in broken strokes. The transparent nature of the medium helped create textures as also deep tones and sonorous color effects. We look at his assessment briefly. Rabindranath Tagore painted for recreation, and it gave him a great sense of freedom. In his paintings, a kind of surreal world comes to life, as if there is no reference to practical reality. His work has been variously assessed. Scholars have hailed him as the first Indian painter of the subconscious, whereas others trace the expressionist mediation between the outer and the inner worlds in his art. A.K. Kumaraswamy was eventually of the view that Tagore had expunged all previous literary experience to produce a truly naive art. Tagore saw himself as working in a self-taught automatic style, whereas Partha Mitra is of the opinion that he needed to regress to his childhood to recover this world of fantasy. Partha Mitra states that Rabindranath Tagore himself emphasized two elements: unpredictability and dream imagery. Tapati Guha Thakurta encapsulates the importance of his art well by stating, modern art was seen to have arrived in India with Gaganendranath Tagore and Rabindranath Tagore.